artifact talk, charts, oogling over numbers. This video is going to have everything to put you to sleep. Hello everyone, Bront, CatHerder here. We're having some fun talking Raid Shadow Legends, and we are going to be talking about artifacts. And I will be making a follow-up on accessories, if this does particularly well, to talk about those as well, because accessories really do kind of need their own specialist talk, because accessories have become their own kind of mess. But many of you, I am very sure, have gone into your champion's gear and noticed that you are somewhere near this, constantly hitting that, getting stuff in your inbox, and trying to figure out what gear is worth keeping, what gear is worth selling. There's unfortunately not a really good answer to this. There are several answers, but it's not an easy, you just sell this, you just keep this. It's going to depend on where you are in the game. It's going to depend on what you're looking for. And it's going to depend on what kind of champs you're building, how you're building your champions, and again, what kind of content you're going to be working on. So I'm going to go over a lot of the basics for gearing. So some of the stuff is going to get very basic, but I'm also going to go into some of the advanced tips for things that might help you cleanse your gear, what gear you should be looking for, when you'd be looking for it, what sets will start off with high value, what sets will end up with great value, and what you're going to want to do as you advance your account as far as what you're looking for in your gear. So with that, strap in, make sure you have some caffeine. And if you have a chance to do this, I appreciate you guys hitting that subscribe button, hitting that like button, smash that subscribe button if you find this type of stuff helpful. I definitely appreciate it, and it will definitely help if you fall asleep later and forget to do it later. Definitely appreciate you guys. Thank you very much. And if you're ever looking for ways to support me, you know what? Just commenting on the video, asking questions on the video, liking it, subscribing, that all helps. I do have a merchandise link down below. I've got some Bront CatHerder merch. You can get t-shirts with my logo on them. You can get bottles with my logo on them. You can get all kinds of cool stuff. And you know what? If there's some stuff you'd like, let me know. In fact, there's some actually really cool stickers. If you like the, waterproof stickers you can stick on your water bottle, well, there's a bunch of cat emote stickers. They're kind of cute. So, but regardless of that, just being here is great. I appreciate all your support. Let's dig in and start talking artifacts. All right, so I said we're going to start at the beginning, and here we are, starting at the beginning. We have the basic artifact goals, and I've got this separated per different piece of equipment. So you've got your top row, which is your weapon, your helmet, and your shield. And things to be aware of those is your weapon can only have flat attack, your helm can only have flat HP, your shield can only have flat defense. A lot of you guys may know that, but not everyone does, so it's definitely worth knowing. And then other things of note is specifically your weapons cannot have defense or defense percent subs, and your shields cannot have attack or attack percent subs. Your helms, however, can have just about anything. That generally means that it is easier to get very good shields and weapons. It's a little bit harder to get very good helmets, just because there's a couple of extra stats that you can get in there, meaning you can get those stats, which could be good, they could be bad. You might be looking for attack percent, so the helmet might be useful for. You might not be. You might get flat attack and flat defense in a helm. That's going to suck. But overall, your top pieces are going to be fairly easy to farm. Because they're always going to have the same main stats, it means you can be just a little bit pickier on them with their substats, or maybe even whether or not they're 5-star or 6-star, or I guess 4-star if you're early on, because you can afford to be picky because it's easier to get good gear because you're not rolling on the top stat as well as on the substats. As far as the bottom sets are concerned, gauntlets are your crit rate and crit damage source. They're the only ones that can do crit rate or crit damage. So generally, if you're looking for nuking gear, you want the crit rate early on, you want crit damage later. And to be fair, even in the late game, crit rate gloves can be very useful, particularly because you can use them to build a speed champion, because you don't have to focus on having as much crit rate on all the other stats, so you can get more speed. So if you need a fast damage dealer, sometimes crit rate gloves are still the right way to go. But crit damage as much as possible will increase the amount of damage you deal when you can get that 100% crit rate. So crit damage and crit rate, definitely good for damage dealers. Focus on crit damage more over crit rate, but especially early on, Or late on, if you need a lot of speed, crit rate's not the worst thing to do. Attack percent, HP percent, defense percent, as well as flat attack, flat HP, and flat defense. You'll hear me talk about flat stats. When I talk about flat stats, I'm specifically talking about flat attack, flat HP, and flat defense. And those are the substats you generally don't want. Those are also the main stats you don't want on the bottom pieces. The only real exception you're going to find is early on when you're building speed set. Sometimes if you have a speed substat on a flat stat glove, or even a flat stat chest, for example, you don't mind having that if you've got the speed on it, because the extra speed that you're going to get will allow you to make a champ faster. And in some cases, speed is all you need on those champions, particularly early. Later on, when you get picky for things or you need champions to survive as well, you're going to get pickier about whether or not you keep those flat speed stuff. But really, that's only effective in your speed sets, because you're not going to want to sacrifice having flat HP on a regeneration piece, for example. You're not going to want flat attack on a nuking piece. And in fact, specifically, attack percent for gloves is very niche, because you're really only going to use that with bomb champions most of the time. That said, if you have to have an attack percent with speed, because it's a speed set, you might still put that on a speed champion, and at least it's attack percent to give them a little more damage that way, if they can even use it. As far as chests are concerned, they are the only ones you can get a main stat of accuracy or resistance, and they have the standard array of attack and attack percent and HP percent, etc., etc. Again, you don't want the flat stats unless you're talking a speed substat in a speed set, and even then, you want to be picky about it as you get later in the game. Overall, your chests are going to kind of reflect what type of champion you have. If you need the accuracy and you can't reach some of the accuracy stats you're looking for otherwise, or you're building an endgame team where you need a lot of accuracy chests can be really good. Resistant chests can be great if you're building a high resistance champion, but that's really the only case where you're really looking for resistance. Attack percent, you're looking for a nuker, so you're probably looking for some nuking stats out there in the subs. The HP percent, defense percent, they can be okay for your HP nukers and your defense-based nukers, but they also can be very good for your support champions. So like a Rector Drath, for example, you'd prefer an HP chest, but you'll settle for a defense percent chest because that still keeps your healer alive, and keeping your healer alive is good. You also are going to want speed and prioritize speed a little bit more on things if you're not going for the damage necessarily, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And finally, boots. And I'll tell you to repeat this after me 3 times. I will put speed boots on my champs. I will put speed boots on my champs. I will put speed boots on my champs. Now, that is not a hard and fast rule at the end game, but early on, you want speed on your boots, and that's really about the only stat that's worth dealing with. In fact, I would not bother keeping any sort of substat boots, as long as you actually can put boots on your champions at least. That's not a speed boot until you start keeping some of the 5-star gear, because that 4-star gear that is not speed boots is really going to slow your champions down, particularly. Now, if you have speed substats, you might be okay if you just kind of got to make do with a couple of boots, but eventually you're going to want speed boots on almost every champion on your account, even in the end game. The few exceptions are going to be some of your nukers, particularly big tanks, and champions that you can get enough speed in other areas that you don't need speed boots specifically. But even then, you're going to kind of struggle to get that level of speed, because you're missing out on up to 45 points of speed on 6-star speed boots, and that's a lot of speed. So speed is super important. Sometimes that means you need at least a speed subset on those boots. And again, you don't want flat attack, flat HP, and flat defense. And in this particular case, they're not worth keeping even if they have speed substats, because in a speed set, you want speed so badly, you're better off with speed boots. And honestly, you're better off going offset speed boots than you are for like flat attack speed boots that happen to have a couple of speed rolls in them. And just remember as well that you cannot have the same main stat and a substat. So for example, your weapons can never have flat attack as a substat because they always have it as the main. If your boots have speed as the main, the boots cannot also have speed as a substat. If you have accuracy as the main stat in your chest, you cannot have accuracy as a substat. Do keep that in mind. That can be confusing for new players. It also can make for some really, really interesting filters if you ever use the filters, where you can filter for, I need an accuracy chest that has accuracy on it, and don't take the accuracy off for some reason and can't find any chests and you're wondering why. Well, that's why. Definitely want to cover Ascensions here quickly as well, because the Ascensions are somewhat new to the game. Some people still don't know this stuff, but for the most part, your Ascensions match the type of gear you have. Now, your top grow can do flat attack, flat defense, or flat HP, and that's it. So nice and simple, but any of those three pieces can do any of those three Ascensions. So you can get HP on a weapon. You can get attack on a shield. It's worth knowing that you can do that, because you can also re-roll it with dust if you get something that you don't really want. But it also makes the top pieces not particularly exciting, because you're better off with the percent if you can do it, because the percent is that much better than flat in almost every single case. In fact, I can't really think of a champion where you're better off with a flat boost than you are with a percent boost wherever you can get a percent boost. That's how powerful the extra percent boost is. So for gauntlets, for example, you can again only get crit rate or crit damage on those. So if you're building damage gear, you're going to want crit rate or crit damage on those as well. And that may depend. Sometimes you actually don't mind a crit damage glove that has a crit rate ascension, because it allows you to get the crit rate you need to use that crit damage glove. Vice versa, if you have a crit rate glove, crit damage on it is great, because you're going to get 50 or 60% crit rate just from the one glove. So getting an extra 20% crit damage is actually probably a little more useful than 10% crit rate on a glove that's already got the crit rate pretty high. As far as the chests are concerned, you're going to want percentages over flat necessarily. And again, resistance, accuracy will really depend on your build. Do, however, keep in mind, if you have an HP percent chest that has an accuracy ascension, that still could be very good, because that accuracy ascension is pretty high. That's a lot of extra accuracy if you need it and you didn't need an accuracy main stat on the chest. And finally, speed is one of the options for boots, but sometimes you may want the extra stat percentages. So you may have a speed boot that gets an attack percentage boost, for example, and on a nuker, you may want the extra attack percentage boots. Not that bad. And vice versa, you may end up with attack percent main boots that ascend in speed. Well, that makes those boots that much more useful, because they're that much faster. So what's going to work correct for your boots is really going to depend on the type of champion, as well as the overall stats you're aiming for. But don't settle for bad rolls. You can always use dust to re-roll them, and you can keep on re-rolling them until you get the stat you want. Sometimes you're not going to get every bit of stat you want, and sometimes it's nice to kind of have some of these stats are good enough for a build right now. For example, if you're building a nuker and you don't get crit damage, but you get attack percent, maybe you decide to save your dust, because attack percent is still useful for that champion. It's not as good as crit damage, but it's still additional damage that you're going to actually get. So sometimes you settle and you deal with what you can deal with. You certainly want to deal with farming the oils and getting that dust so you can re-roll those when you need them, because getting these ascensions is extremely important in getting the stats you want. For the most part, there are two types of gear. There's damage dealing gear and support gear. However, I mention niche because sometimes there's some edge cases for some of those sets for something you might need. So damage dealing gear is what you're putting on your nukers, on your damage dealers, champions that you intend to do damage often first. And crit rate and crit damage are the two most important stats there, followed by speed. Speed, as you'll see, is on all of these lists, because for the most part, you need speed, with a couple of exceptions. And then finally, the main damage stat is kind of the fourth stat you're looking for in most cases for a nuker. Some nukers may require accuracy because of how they're built. So if you need accuracy, obviously accuracy is going to have to take place of one of those stats, and it's certainly going to mean you're dealing a little bit less damage. But accuracy on a damage dealing piece doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's going to be useful if you actually need the accuracy on that particular champion. If I'm building an attack-based nuker, I want attack percent, or flat attack is okay, especially if I already have attack percent as the main. I want crit rate, crit damage, and speed on the subs. Obviously, if I'm going with a glove, I'm not going to get crit rate or crit damage because one of those two should be the main on the glove. For the chest, you're not going to get percent attack because you want attack there. For the boots, if you've got speed boots, then you're going to want that main damage stat down there. If you can, you definitely want the crit rate and crit damage. If you're going percent boots, then you're going to want some speed on there if you can to get your speed back up so that you can actually nuke things and take a turn. Finally, you do not need resistance on nuking gear. There is no such thing as a resistance-based nuker. There just is not. The reason that you would put resistance is to keep a champion alive. A reason you would want to keep a champion alive and undebuffed is because you want them to heal the rest of your team or pick the rest of your team back up. Yes, you want your nukers to be able to survive, but oftentimes you're not building them with resistance because building them with resistance means that you're going to be sacrificing a lot of the damage you would like to do otherwise. So generally, resistance on damage gear is bad. For support gear, speed is generally your number one concern. Accuracy is probably your number two concern. However, not every piece actually needs accuracy because there are plenty of supports that don't need accuracy at all. For example, an Elva doesn't have anything that she lands as far as a debuff is concerned. So she needs speed, then you want HP defense, and of course you want percent over flat, but flat defense and flat HP is not the worst thing in the world, especially if you've got a lot of speed on that piece as well. So don't throw it out just because it's got flat defense and flat HP, especially if it rolls a bunch of speed. But again, you might start to get picky as you get better peer in there as well. Accuracy is great, but if you have a champ that doesn't need accuracy, then that piece is not helpful if it's got a ton of accuracy either. So be aware of what you need for the support. Crit rate can be helpful for some support champions because some support champions do need to crit to land debuffs or do something else as well. So that's important. Resistance is also important. Resistance can be very important for support champions, especially if you're building high resistance support champions. However, you either need resistance or you don't. So a little bit of resistance here, a little bit of resistance there doesn't necessarily hurt, but having just a little bit of resistance doesn't help unless it's enough resistance to add up and actually make it worthwhile to possibly prevent you from getting debuffed in some way, shape, or form. Finally, crit damage is generally not needed in support, but it's not that it's the worst thing in the world. It does depend on the champion. For ally protectors, for example, you generally don't want crit damage because crit damage on ally attackers means that they take more damage. It's just the way ally attack works. They take if they get crit, they take damage based off of their own crit damage. So you don't want a high crit damage on them. Otherwise, it doesn't hurt to have crit damage on these support pieces, but in general, it's not needed. And if you get crit damage mixed with a bunch of other support and you start hitting into the crit damage, unless that piece could also be a good damage dealing piece, it's probably something worth selling. Finally, there are a couple of times where you're going to have some niche gear. Gear without speed is generally niche. There's some reasons to use it because there's a couple of champions you don't want to build fast, particularly things like a Stone Skin UDK is traditionally built with not a lot of speed because you don't want him taking turns to have that Stone Skin fall off, for example. Urost can solo the Scarab by taking damage, so you actually don't want him taking a lot of turns. He needs a little bit of speed, but he needs 10 to 20 points of speed if you can build him with enough defense and enough HP in the right gear to heal himself, and then he can solo the Scarab. Another optional one is sometimes you don't mind having attack on support gear. There's a couple of champions that actually get better based off of attack. For example, Raglan can heal based off of attack, and she actually can do a little bit of damage. I wouldn't build her for damage, but getting a little extra attack will give her heals a little bit of a boost, so that's an option. And attack support gear is also going to be good for your bomb champions. Those are the only champions you're probably going to be using attack percent gloves on. You're going to want the accuracy, you're going to want the speed, because you want to get those bombs out there, you want the bombs to land, and you want them to do damage, which is based off your attack. And that's also where the attack percent gloves kind of come in as well. So those are pretty much one and the same in that case. Finally, resistance and crit damage just don't mix. Remember how I said resistance and nuking don't go together? Well, if you have a piece that has resistance and crit damage and you start rolling into both of those, that piece is kind of split and it doesn't know where it goes. Early on, because you might need all of the substats you can get, you might keep something that has a little bit of resistance and a little bit of crit damage. But as you advance your account, you're eventually going to find that things that have resistance and crit damage together are not going to be as useful, particularly because crit damage is niche only for shoring up a damage dealer. Resistance is niche only for showing up a support. So you have a piece that doesn't shore up a support particularly well and doesn't shore up a damage dealer very well. Therefore, you're not going to use it a lot. So resistance plus crit damage, probably not a good mix. Definitely something that you could start selling, especially as you get later in the game when you can start getting picky about what gear you keep. So I'm not going to go into every single set and tell you where it belongs on this chart. Part of this is understanding the general use of a particular set, and part of it is just understanding what you're trying to do with the set. But the idea is to identify some sets are going to be damage dealing sets, which is sets like your retaliation, which is in counterattack. Crit damage is obviously a damage set. Lifesteal is a set you want to be doing damage in, because the idea is it's part of the damage you do is part that you heal. So if you're not doing damage in lifesteal, you're better off with something else, because you're better off with something that keeps you alive better than the lack of damage you're doing, having a little bit of extra healing. Fury is another one that's a nuking set. Destroy, when you're destroying max HP based off the damage you do, you want to be doing damage. Any of the ignore defense sets. There's a lot of them out there now. There's a couple of 9-piece sets out there. There's obviously Savage is the classic one. There's Instinct, and then there's Lethal as well. So Zeal is another damage dealing set. Things that give you bonus crit damage, things that help you do more damage, those are your damage dealing sets. And if it's not something that really gives you a bonus to dealing damage, and to be fair, sometimes a set that gives you just bonus stats can be helpful for damage dealing as well. If you've got a defense-based nuker, something that gives you bonus defense, not the worst. Same with an HP nuker, that something gives you bonus HP, not the worst for dealing damage. But generally, your damage dealing gear is going to be the stuff that I've mentioned here, and that's the stuff you're looking for those damage dealing substats we talked about earlier. Support gear is going to be more of the gear that's going to support your account. So these are the ones that you're going to be putting your healers in. These are the ones you're going to be putting your debuffers in. These are the ones that you're going to be putting your revivers in. The champions that keep your team alive, or make your team go faster, or just make your team go. Cursed can be a very good support gear, because Cursed is something you might put on an AoE champion that is not doing a lot of damage, but is there to support the team. So like a Nekmothar in Cursed could be good. Provoke is another example of something like that, but Provoke can be a little bit of both, possibly. Regen gear, you're generally going to want support stats in regen gear. There's a few niche builds that might have nuking gear in regen, but in general, you're looking to put your revivers or champions you want to stay alive in regen gear. Sometimes you may want some nuking gear just because you might be putting a nuker to solo a boss in regen gear. But honestly, you're probably better off mostly focusing on support stuff with regen. Stalwart, another one. Again, you're looking to keep champions alive. You want support stats. Frost and Frostbite, you're going to want support attacks because you're going to be able to need to survive that attack to throw that Frost back out with the Frost or Frostbite. Protection set, Supersonic, Guardian, Immortal. These are your support things. These are the things you're going to find on your champions. You're going to be throwing these on your Syl the Drakes. You're going to be throwing these on your War Maidens. You're going to be throwing these on your Duck the Pierced. You're going to be throwing these on your Tyrells, those type of champions. You'll notice I didn't mention accuracy and perception gear. That's because that gear can be a nuker piece, or it could be a support piece. As you advance, you're probably going to find you're going to look for more support pieces out of perception and accuracy. But a perception or an accuracy nuking piece can be very good for a champion that you need to land debuffs. So if you have a Herndig, for example, Herndig is powered by his debuffs as much as anything else. So you want those debuffs. A Tomb Lord, for example, you want him to get those debuffs out there as well. So you're going to need that, but you do need some nuking stats on a Tomb Lord as well. So they're going to need both. Speed gear is good regardless, because sometimes you just need to go fast, and so having that speed gear available in nuking or in support is great. Relentless is such a flexible set because you can use it for damage dealers that you want to take extra turns, particularly in things like Hydra, but you can also use it on supports that you want to take extra turns for your Doom Priests or your Syl the Drakes, for example. Immunity can be very good for either support or damage dealing. It certainly falls off late, but the immunity set can be very good for either one of them, because one of the ways you can certainly keep debuffs off a champion. Stun set. Stun set you want super fast, but you can have damage dealers in stun. In fact, if you have a Skull Crown, for example, Skull Crown is actually a good champion to put a damage dealing stun set on if you can manage to do it. That's where the impulse and reflex gear as well. So the gears that help you reset skills. Sometimes you want nuking gear because sometimes you want to reset a nuke ability, particularly for like Cold Hearts, for example, are good ones to throw something like that on. That's the general style of what you're looking for. You're looking for sets that you know what the purpose of the set is, and you know how to use it with the substats that it's going to have. So the more you can focus that, the easier it is to keep your gear clean and to not keep gear that you're just not going to use. You know, it doesn't help to have a lot of support Savage, for example, because you're just not going to be putting it on your champions most of the time. But honestly, if you're growing, sometimes you just take the best pieces you have and it doesn't matter what set it's in. So it's going to also depend a little bit on where you are in the game as far as whether or not you need to be strictly adherent to, is this a damage dealing set? Is this a support set? Is this a set that I can take either one of these on? Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that some sets lose value as you move on in the game. And here's a good list of a lot of these. Life, offense, defense, and crit rate, as well as the divine versions, are not great pieces of gear to start with. Crit rate can be very helpful super early on when you're struggling to get that crit rate, but eventually you want crit rate substats, meaning you don't need crit rate gear. You would rather have the extra stats, or you would rather have a set that does something more important for you than just bonus crit rate. And the amount of crit rate you get is not that great. Same with the life, same with defense, same with offense. They're very usable early on as 2-piece offsets for a 4-piece set. But overall, you're going to find that you don't need to use these that often. And when it comes to a point where you're starting to keep only gear for sets you think you might be using, those are ones that are pretty easy to start trimming early on. Fury and Toxic are another niche set. I list them as sets that lose value because early on, when you're looking for any good gear, you're going to keep pretty much all the gear you get and just hope that it's good. But Fury and Toxic are really only useful for the most part for Clan Boss. Now, Fury can certainly help. I know Fury can sometimes help with Leo, and you can also use Toxic in some Clan Boss teams. As they get lower in HP, they'll do more damage. It can actually help quite a bit for your damage in Clan Boss. But really, you're looking to build a team that doesn't necessarily need both of those or most of those. Toxic is certainly a little more helpful for some of the Clan Boss teams, particularly because if you can build a champion in Toxic when you don't have a lot of poisons, that can add 10 million damage to a Ultra Nightmare run. So that can be very helpful. But outside of that, and outside of a few champions that can really take advantage of those sets very specifically, there's very little use of Toxic and Fury. So as you start trimming gear, there are good ones to look at and just start trimming. Frenzy, Avenging, and Daze are really, really, really bad. Sleeping Cheeple is not great. It's not a good control. You're better off with either Provoke or Stun. Avenging Gear does not counterattack reliably enough because it is only if you get debuffed. And, well, you don't want to get debuffed if you can avoid it. You honestly don't want to get hit if you can avoid it as well. Not particularly great. And it's a 4-piece set. It's just bad. Frenzy, not great either. Again, you need to be debuffed in order to get the turn meter boost, so it's not a reliable set in really anywhere in the game. Just start selling those when you no longer need to keep them. Shield set has got a few niche uses, but with Bolster coming out, Bolster is a much better set than Shield because it's a protected shield. It lasts, I believe, for an extra turn, and you get healing out of it as well, so Bolster can substitute as a regeneration set at some point in time for you, and it helps you long term, even though it gives you the initial shield and the initial shield falls off. Other uses end up falling off for Stone Skin, because Stone Skin protects your champions a lot better. Now, shield is certainly something that gives everybody a shield, but there's also ways to get past shields now in Arena, which is where it was also used as well. So shield is just really fallen off, not a particularly great set. There's a few very specific uses for it, but for the most part, you don't need a lot of shield gear, particularly if you end up spending on Bolster. or you get a bunch of stone skin, you'll eventually find that once you start collecting a lot of stone skin, you're not going to use the shield gear that much, if at all. Lifesteal gear, very, very good early, falls off really quickly because you eventually want something other than lifesteal healing your champions. But for keeping you alive in campaign farming early, lifesteal is great. For keeping you alive in clan boss early, lifesteal is great. But eventually you want to start using passives, leeches, support champions, other things to keep you alive and healed, or you start blocking the damage, or you do something like that, or you just nuke fast enough that it doesn't matter because the enemy doesn't get a turn. You stop needing lifesteal. But do keep your logon lifesteal. Those 4-star pieces that you get from the logon are absolutely amazing. They have all the right substats as well. They are some of the best gear you're going to find, and really the only 4-star gear I would ever recommend rolling up. So there's good lifesteal gear, and you might eventually find better lifesteal gear, but it does fall off fairly early in the game as you start climbing. Curing is another set that's not really good just about anywhere. It got a buff recently, and honestly, I still don't think the buff is enough. The problem that curing has is that curing helps you heal when you're casting healing, which sounds great, but generally champions that are good healers already do enough healing, or the healing is powered off of something that they can improve otherwise. So, for example, if I have healing based off of my HP, I would rather have 2 sets of immortal gear to give me plus 20% max HP than I would with the curing bonus of 20% or 30% or whatever it happens to be. Partially because I also get some regeneration with that immortal set. Regeneration gear is also much better than curing because I'd rather have my healer and reviver constantly healing and staying alive to keep everyone else alive or to revive everyone when they need to. So curing just really doesn't have a particularly good use. It does repair some max HP, but again, there's other ways to do max HP. There's blessings that do it just as well, if not better. And curing being a 4-piece set is really, really lacking. I don't recommend keeping a lot of it if you can. Immunity used to be one of the best sets in the game, and Stone Skin basically overnight removed it from the game. Now, immunity is not useless because there's cases where you might want Stone Skin and immunity. And sometimes you just want the immunity, and then there's sets that are kind of similar to it, such as the Feral set kind of operates like immunity, but with extra stat bonuses. But that's another reason immunity is not worth keeping around, because why would I use immunity when I could use Feral that gives me an additional 80 accuracy and 10% speed in addition to the immunity? So immunity, not particularly good, and in order to actually make it useful, you need the best of the best substats for it anyway. So it needs to be very, very, very good gear to even think about using in the first place. So as a set, immunity, really kind of lackluster. Resilience is a valuable silver set. It's one of the 2 ones you can farm pretty regularly. And because you can farm it and you can craft it, it's great for crafting. It's great for filling in little 2 pieces here and there, give you a little extra defense, a little extra HP. It's a decent set. It's part of the reason that life and defense sets are not useful, because you can craft so much resilience. You can get really good resilience gear very easily. But overall, you don't need a lot of it, because eventually those basic stat boosts aren't enough to really make them worthwhile keeping late game. So very useful filler set early, especially for making your champion stay alive. Can kind of be okay to fill here and there later on, but overall, you're going to find that resilience gear is going to be less and less useful as you advance your account, so it'll definitely fall off. Stalwart gear has a similar lifespan. Because it's a 4-piece set, it becomes very hard to use. And keeping a specific champion alive, you're generally going to want something like Stone Skin for early on, or regeneration to keep them from constantly healing and just build them super tanky. Stalwart can reduce damage that champions take, particularly its AoE damage. Can be very helpful in a couple of very specific situations, but overall it's a very niche set that once you find you don't need it anymore, you stop needing it and it's got no use of any kind whatsoever. Definitely one you can start paring down early. You're going to want support value out of that when you can use it, but overall, Stone Skin tends to fill a lot of the niche for that, as does just things like regeneration. And finally, accuracy is a good set very early on, because very early on it's tough to get accuracy. But perception is so easy to get because you can craft so much of it, because you get a ton of it from running faction wars, which you should be doing constantly, even in the end game. So eventually you will be able to craft 1,000 pieces of perception without too much of a problem. If you craft 1,000 pieces of perception, you're going to get better pieces than you would with accuracy. It's got better bonuses because it has the extra speed, and because you can craft it, you can be super picky with it, and you can farm a lot more of it with crafting than you easily could by farming dragon and kind of getting accuracy. So accuracy loses a lot of value late in the game. On the other hand, we have some sets that gain in value, and these are the sets that you're going to find yourself using into the late game more and more. Specifically, there are a bunch of 9-piece sets now in the game, and 9-piece sets offer extreme flexibility and tons of bonus stats. This means you can build 1 or 2 pieces of a 9-piece set on somebody for nuking, and you're fine, even if it's a nuking-based substat. You're getting a couple of nuking stats out of it. If you can't put them in the full set, that's fine. Things like Stone Skin offer all kinds of flexibility for extra substats that you might need, as well as, of course, extra bonuses like the ability to have Stone Skin on, or Protection Set giving you additional protection so that your buffs can't be stolen, or eventually you have extra damage if you can get a full 9-piece on. These 9-piece sets are super flexible, and they certainly give you extra stats. The fact that you can get these extra stats and extra substats on accessories that you might not have been able to do otherwise make them ultra powerful. So the 9-piece sets are something that you're generally going to want to be a little more flexible with. Now, there's still some level of stay in your lane. For example, protection is a speed set, so you want speed on every protection piece you're keeping for the most part. Stone Skin can be a nuking set, but you're going to find more value probably out of some of the protection to keep some champions alive. But again, there's some good nuking sets in Stone Skin. Stone Skin, you don't always need speed because sometimes you want a champion slow in Stone Skin, so sometimes you don't need speed in Stone Skin. Stone Skin's very, very flexible from that end. You've got Slayer and Malice set, and those are great for doing damage. They can give you extra crit stats, they can give you extra attack stats, they can ignore defense. Very good sets. And of course, you've got the Supersonic, which can help you have champions that can do interrupting things because they can push their turn meter forward and jump in when you want them to. These 9-piece sets are super valuable. You're going to find a lot of use for them late game. I suspect we're going to see more and more of these as the game moves on, particularly because we already had one of them in the event dungeon in Pinpoint, which is really one of the better sets in the game. Crit damage is one of these weird, tricky sets where crit damage in general tends to grow in the game because you can eventually get more and more crit damage as you get better and better pieces in the first place, particularly with some of these 9-piece sets that give you some of the extra crit rate or extra crit damage. And crit damage set can be very good. And that's why the crit damage set is useful when the crit rate set is not, because that extra 20% crit damage is huge. That's 3 rolls of crit damage on a piece of gear split over 2 different pieces. Definitely worthwhile to go for crit damage and have that around. That said, eventually you're going to be looking at ignore damage. You're going to be looking at 9-piece damage sets. So crit damage will at some point in time fall off as a set, but it's still a very useful set to have around because crit damage is one of the things that really scales and shows you how much extra damage you can do towards the end game. Stun gear is something that gains in value. Stun gear is useful super early for wave clear, useful for faction wars to help you get through faction wars with AoE attackers that can stun people, but it's also become very useful in Centranos for getting through some of these floors. And again, you're going to be running these floors a couple times with stun gear, hoping the stuns go off, but this stun gear can help you get through places you might struggle with otherwise. In secret rooms with AoE champs, occasionally even be useful in arena because the sets can't be resisted. Overall stun gear, very good to have. You want fast stun gear, so do keep that in mind. You want speed on your stun gear pretty much no matter what. Ignore defense sets. Ignore defense is the single best way to do damage in this game from a direct damage standpoint. So champions that need to do this direct damage, you're going to want them ignoring as much defense as possible. So the ignore defense sets, very, very good end game. Plus these things stack. So the more ignore defense effects you can stack, that's where Helm Smasher comes in as well. That's where other bonuses might come in. This is why you might put cruel gear on a defense-based nuker, because you want Savage plus Cruel is a 30% ignore defense, plus an additional 25 is 55% ignore defense. That adds up. It adds up really quickly. Definitely keep track of your ignore defense sets. They're all good, even the ones that are only 20%, even the ones that are the one-offs that are 5%. Any ignore defense can help rank your damage up quite a bit. Self-healing sets are some of the best sets in the game, because the self-healing sets help you keep champions alive, especially in long-form combat, such as Hydra, for example. So regeneration is great for a lot of champions in Hydra. Bolster is very good for a lot of people in Hydra. Guardian can be very good as well. Guardian is the underrated self-healing set, because Guardian can help you take damage on a champion, have that champion take that damage. Other people don't take as much, so you're kind of soaking it a little bit and having somebody that's tanky take some of that damage, and then they heal themselves, because Guardian has a 10% heal rate as well. Not quite as good as regeneration, but overall Guardian is a great set, and those are really good for soloing content, and those are really good for keeping people alive on your team, both keeping your supports alive, and in some cases keeping your nuker alive, because having Guardian can be super useful. There's a couple of niche sets as well. You don't necessarily need to keep tons of good pieces in these, but you should keep some. Cursed and Provoke, for example, you're only going to need maybe 3 to 5 sets of each of those, but they can be very useful for Hydra. They can be very useful in a couple of other wave clear contexts as well. Even Provoke could be useful in Arena a little bit, but you're not going to be putting it on too many champions, and you really want some of the best stats you can get on that. So you don't need to keep tons of it, but you're going to want to have some of it towards the end of the game. That said, Curse, not very useful early game. Provoke, not very useful early game. So you may find you don't keep a lot of it early on, or you just kind of hoard a few things and keep a few things here and there and use the pieces that you can use as offsets before you start actually collecting Cursed or Provoke. And again, that also requires you to farm Ice Golem. A lot of people don't like farming Ice Golem, so I understand that you may not have a lot of that till late game. But Ice Golem, actually worth farming late game because of those two sets. And then finally, high resistance gear. There's no such thing as halfway with resistance. You either need all the resistance you need, or you don't have enough. So if you're talking about resisting things in the end game, you're often looking at 450 to 500 resistance for doing hard 10 dungeons. You're looking at 350 for normal 25 dungeons. You're looking for over 500 in Arena for it to even be worthwhile going in with resistance in the first place. And towards the end game, you're looking at 700, 800, 900 resistance being what you need. So high resistance gear can be very useful in the end game, but at the same time, you need all the resistance, or you don't need it at all. And that's why I said that things like crit damage and resistance don't mix, because you're not going to put resistance on your nukers, because you have to sacrifice too many other stats to go full resistance. That's not worth it. Whereas your supports, they have a little bit of extra resistance. It's not the worst thing. If you end up with enough resistance to make it worthwhile, that's great. And if you decide you want to build a champion with the resistance, you're going to want a resistance banner, and you're going to want a resistance chest, because that's almost 200 extra resistance. So it's very important. So I'm going to gloss over this pretty quickly, because we've definitely been going for a while. But the set values early, mid-game, and late game. Early on, Lifesteal is great, Speed is great, Relentless is great. The 9P sets are going to be helpful because they're just extra stats. You're not going to get a lot of them, but they exist. But overall, you're looking for stats over sets in the early game, because you're looking to get to certain thresholds, and you're looking to be able to do certain things. You're looking for enough accuracy. You're looking for enough crit rate to be able to do damage. You're looking for enough speed to go the speeds you need to go. So early on, stats over sets. Don't worry about the sets too much. Just worry about getting good gear. Once you move into the mid game, accuracy and perception, particularly perception, is going to be the lifeblood of your account for a while, because it gives you extra speed and it gives you tons of accuracy. But accuracy can be helpful as well. Relentless, great set still. Speed, great set still. 9-piece, great set still. And very good as you're getting into the mid game. This is where you start to worry about maybe starting to get a set or two of something that ignores defense. This is where the regeneration and immortal stuff may come in as far as being useful, particularly for things like faction wars. Getting your reviver and regen and immortal means you can keep your reviver alive when you're going through faction wars to get those 3 stars. And finally, things like crit damage and being able to do crit damage and get people in crit damage gloves. That's more a value of a specific stat than it is anything else, although the crit damage gear could be useful in the mid game as well, especially if you can't build a lot of ignore defense. If you can stack a lot of crit damage, you can still do a decent amount of damage. And finally, in the mid game is when you might find things like your toxic, your destroy set, being useful. Reflex could be possibly useful here. Immunity could be useful here. The reason I have those as niche is because while they're decent sets, particularly Reflex and Immunity could be useful, well, Reflex mostly, you don't always have the luxury of doing a 4-piece set or having a good 4-piece set in those into the mid-game until you're later in the mid-game. And finally, as you get into late game, the ignore defense becomes more and more valuable. You start having more of your nukers in ignore defense because you start farming lethal, you start having better cruel, you start farming some savage, you maybe even purchase some instinct gear, for example. There's all kinds of things that can be super helpful in the late game with ignore defense. You also have 9-piece sets, and 9-piece sets continue to rise in value because the 9-piece sets gives you all kinds of interesting flexibility. And then, of course, regen, bolster, guardian becomes super important in the late game because that's oftentimes where you're using for soloing stuff, or you need it for champions to keep them alive and other content as well. You also find things like reflex becomes more important in this game. Impulse is also a very good set for from Live Arena. Relentless continues to be very good, but it does certainly lose a little bit of its luster towards the late game. But then again, that has more to do with the fact that there's so many good sets that the extra turn isn't always as important as doing the extra damage from ignore defense, for example. Immortal continues to be generally useful, but it falls off a little bit compared to regeneration, just because it's okay, but regeneration or bolster or guardian is still a better 4-piece set than the immortal in 4 pieces. Speed set, always good, not as good in the end game because things like protection gear gives you almost the same amount of speed as speed, but gives you so much extra other stats that sometimes it's better off to have yourself in 9-piece protection, for example, than it might be in speed set, for example. Stun continues to be very useful at this point in time because of some of the late game where you might need to stun people. I mentioned stun still is a little bit of a niche. It's definitely good to have, but it can be kind of niche. And Cursed, Provoke, and other damage sets could be helpful as well. And by other damage sets, I'm talking about things like your Zeal set. Maybe that's where crit damage starts to become a little less exciting for you. Things that do additional amounts of damage can still be useful in the late game, but they're not as useful as the ignore defense was. And finally, we have the importance of rolls. Now, this is rolling up your substats, and this is part of why epic and legendary gear and mythical gear is better than rare gear and below. But some of this is also why having a 6-star piece is better than a 5-star piece. A 6-star piece, all of the substats can roll higher than a 5-star piece, and the main stat can go higher than the 5-star piece. That doesn't mean that a 5-star piece can't be useful, because sometimes you can get really good rolls on a 5-star piece. But basically what you're going to find is the 5-star pieces that you might keep towards the end game are going to need double roll, triple rolls and something good, or at least be super focused and have none of the bad stats that you want. And then they might be useful. And even then, a 6-star piece that's just kind of okay may still prove to be more useful than a 5-star piece. But specifically, if you can get 2 or 3 hits in the same stat, it makes gearing a lot easier. Having a triple hit in speed makes you that much faster. It also means that you could maybe ignore a piece that might have only had 1 speed roll, and then this one doesn't have a speed roll. And so, hey, you can still get the speed you're looking for. Same with things like crit rate or crit damage. You know, being able to hit the thresholds you need because you've got a high roll in one particular piece make it gearing a lot easier for you. But that said, if you get 1 roll into 3 different good substats, well, let's take a nuking piece, for example. If I've got a piece of Savage that's an epic piece of Savage that has 1 hit in crit rate, 1 hit in crit damage, 1 hit in speed, It's a very good piece. I'm going to find a lot of use for that because it's overall very useful because it's got a good spread of stats. Speed is definitely one of the most valuable multi-hit stats, particularly because sometimes you're aiming for some ridiculously high speeds at the end of the game. I've got a couple champions that are over 400 speed, and mine are still slow if you're looking at endgame, late arena in like live gold 4 or in platinum. So speed is super important. Speed kills in this game. So having things that are triple or quad rolls of speed may be kept regardless of what set it is in. But obviously, if it's in an important set, those are gold. Those are amazing. And honestly, just about any set can use triple rolls in speed, as long as it at least has some other useful substats as well. Multiple hits into bad substats can make a piece worth selling. And a good example of this, for example, is say I have a nuking piece. Say I've got a legendary piece where I've got crit rate, crit damage, speed, and resistance in Savage. And I roll triple resistance. That piece is no longer useful because that resistance is not going to help me build a champion in Savage. So sometimes you roll off. Sometimes you may roll a bunch of flat stats, and that may make a piece not particularly useful. You might roll resistance, that may make a piece not particularly useful. You might roll crit damage, and that might make a piece not useful because it's a support piece. Keep in mind, you got to be wary about what multiple hits are going to be good, what multiple hits are going to be bad. And whether or not you want to save them for Chaos Oring or whether or not you want to just sell them, that's going to depend on where you are, a little bit of how much you spend, and how much Chaos Ore you have on your account. The top pieces are easier to get than the bottom pieces. So this is important because you don't have to worry about the random rolls of the main stat on top pieces. It is easier to get a really good helm, a really good weapon, and a really good shield. So as a result, be pickier with those. Particularly, that's a good place where you may not want to keep some of your lower 4-star gear early on, and later on, that's where you want to get rid of your 5-star gear as you go, or maybe that's where you get picky about, I need to hit only good substats, and if I start rolling bad substats, those pieces get sold. Particularly with the next piece here, you can eventually will have multiple similar pieces. It doesn't help if I've got 5 pieces of savage weapons, for example, that have crit rate, crit damage, and speed. Well, what I may start looking at then is how well did they all roll? And I'll sell off some of the ones that didn't roll into the stats I'm really looking for. So I might keep one that rolled really high speed. I might keep a couple that rolled really high crit rates. The one that rolled all into crit damage may end up not getting kept just because I don't have enough of the other stats. Or maybe, hey, this one didn't actually have the third stat, so it's only got attack percent instead of speed. Well, I know I'm going to want speed, and I've got 5 other pieces I think I'd rather use on most champions. Maybe this one gets sold. When you're looking, and 5 is kind of just a number I took out of there, but once you've got 5 pieces that are nearly identical, start being picky about which ones they are. And at some point in time, it maybe even include being picky about what they rolled, because you can get a triple roll in crit rate and get a really high number, and you can get a triple roll in crit rate and get a really low number. So sometimes if you roll the minimum on crit rate on all 3 of those, for example, you may decide to sell that one anyway because you have better gear, even though that one's the triple roll. Finally, gear ascensions can help with bad substats, but keep in mind that you don't want to take a piece that's not good and try to make it good with gear ascensions, because at some point in time, you're still going to want to replace that piece. That said, if it's helping you make a set, obviously making the set can be very important in the end game, so you may end up making do occasionally or use an ascension. But don't waste ascension materials when you don't need to, and don't waste those rerolls unless you know what you want to do with that particular piece, because that dust is gold. And finally, focus on the bottom pieces rather than the top pieces for ascending gear. The percentage stats you get from the bottom, the crit rate, the crit damage, the accuracy, the resistance, the extra speed, those are so much more valuable than a little bit of extra flat attack, flat defense, or flat HP. So focus on your bottom pieces first. Make sure that those are perfect before you focus on the top pieces. Doesn't mean you don't have to roll up your top pieces, because you've got a 1 in 3 chance of getting the stat you want, possibly 2 or 3 if you just don't want attack. Then you can roll those up if you need to, but you don't need to be re-rolling those on most champions until you've got the bottom pieces sorted out, because the bottom pieces are going to give you so much more.
2 hours later.
And finally, if you're ever curious about where you get some of this information, under the filter, you can actually get a lot of information about artifacts. So if you ever have questions, you're ever unsure what some of these sets do, use the help. It's actually pretty good. And research. Don't be afraid to read a little bit. Don't be afraid to watch videos like this or check other videos out that help you learn the things that you need to learn to gear your champions better and make your account better. You control a lot of your progression, and knowing how to do it will help you enjoy the game more rather than struggling to figure out why didn't I do this? Why can't I do this? Why am I struggling in this content? Sometimes it's as simple as just knowing how to gear a champion, knowing what to gear. So appreciate you guys for hanging out. If you want to see a couple examples of how I gear my champions, I'll have a video linked over here that talks about gearing my champions. And until the next video, I'm Bront CatHerder.